It was a little unrealistic to see an ambassador fly in on a private plane, something that was happening that you felt you were almost in a movie. At the beginning of my career, I was in Colombia at the time of the drug cartels and Pablo Escobar, and you know, I think they're a little bit glorified in the show beyond what I remember them as being. Let me welcome you to Habib House, which is this fantastic mixture of Korean architecture, Hanok style, plus American wood from Oregon and Tennessee, with an Alliance beer, and was made to celebrate our 70th anniversary of the Alliance.
Wow. We have the American Eagle, Star-Spangled Banner,
right,
and you have Taegukgi and Tiger on the other side.
Exactly.
That's like our conversation today.
Well, it is.
In Korea, we usually have fried chicken with beer.
You know, fried chicken is very popular in the United States. We have fast food chains like Kentucky Fried Chicken, Popeyes, which is here. We don't necessarily think of it with beer, but I had the chicken and beer at the baseball games that I've attended. It's a very good tradition. Yeah, sure.
I understand that you're from Boston.
Originally, yes.
One of the most iconic rivalry, inner city rivalry in the US is between Boston and New York, between Red Sox and Yankees. So as somebody who's from both cities, I don't know if you can diverge this. Are you a Red Sox fan or have you turned to Yankees?
I lived in New York for several years, but you know, being a Red Sox fan is a birthright. It's not something you even choose for most Bostonians and New Englanders. So my father was a Red Sox fan, my grandfather was a Red Sox fan, I'm a Red Sox fan. So you can't get away from it. And I would never change loyalties.
How would you describe the culture of New York City as being different from the culture of the city of Boston?
Well, New York is absolutely unique in the world. It's a city of immigrants. I think now 47% of the inhabitants of New York, the people who live in New York, were born somewhere else, in another country. There are these striving immigrants who become part of the U.S. and assimilate and thrive in many cases. So it's really an international city on that level. But it's also one of the most American of cities because it's where the American dream comes through and comes true. So it's really a unique place in the United States.
Mm-hmm. After Boston, I understand you went to New York.
Yeah.
What were you doing in New York?
In New York, I was working for a part of the city government that was the liaison with the United Nations and Consular Corps. So we helped settle some of the issues surrounding the presence of the UN and consulates in New York. We had some very difficult problems like trying to collect the money for traffic tickets, parking tickets from diplomats. Those were probably more difficult issues than some of the ones I deal with now.
Have you seen some of the TV shows or movies where U.S. diplomats are portrayed?
Unfortunately, the image of diplomats that's shown in popular culture is of people living well and going to cocktail parties and the rest. And you might think the same looking around here at Habib House, but for the most part, our people are out in many places that are very difficult, not just in places where we have more traditional relationships like here in South Korea, or living conditions which are so nice as here in South Korea.
Have you seen the Netflix series, The Diplomat?
I watched a little bit of it. I have to say it wasn't the most realistic depiction. First of all, I think we've had one career ambassador in London, our history. And so that in and of itself was unrealistic. It was a little unrealistic to see an ambassador fly in on a private plane without Senate confirmation, which is a key part of our process. But it's fun, and it's a good depiction. It shows that diplomats, at least what I saw of it, are involved in important national security issues, not just in this kind of depiction of cocktail parties.
When we're preparing for this interview, one of the key words that's been stressed was the fact that you are a career diplomat as opposed to a political appointee.
Right.
And I guess a lot of laymen like myself don't really know the distinction between the two.
Everybody in our embassy is a career diplomat who serve at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. And that's true below the ambassador level in all the countries. It's staffed by people who do this as a career. But we have a certain percentage of our ambassadors who are political appointees. They are people who might be involved in politics, they might be involved in business, they may be involved in campaigns. So maybe 40% of our ambassadors around the world, especially in places like Europe, are political appointees. They're appointed by the president. I'm appointed by the president too as a career diplomat, but at the same time, my career has been in the State Department as a diplomat with a formation that is not unlike the military in a way. You start out as a second lieutenant and you make your way up, in my case, to being what would be the equivalent of a general.
What are some of the most memorable posts you've been in?
Oh, I've been in a lot of memorable posts.
If you had a top 5.
At the beginning of my career, I was in Colombia at the time of the drug cartels and Pablo Escobar and all of the danger that came with that.
Have you seen Narcos?
I knew the protagonists in Narcos. I knew those DEA agents.
Wow.
And I was there at the time. You know, I think they're a little bit glorified in the show beyond what I remember them as being. That was more about the DEA than about diplomats. I was in South Africa at the time of the transition from all-white government, the apartheid government, to Nelson Mandela. In fact, in the final weeks of my tour in South Africa, I got to attend Nelson Mandela's inauguration. Those are memorable moments. I was at the Dayton Peace Conference on the Balkans, working for Richard Holbrooke, or working on a resolution to the Kosovo conflict, and I later served there as chief of mission. And then getting to the ambassadorial level, having had 4 appointments as an ambassador and 1 as an assistant secretary of state. So all of those are memorable, but some of those earlier experiences were really, you were involved in history and in something that was happening that you felt you were almost in a movie.
A lot of people, like you say, think of diplomacy as a glamorous job.
Right.
But probably stems from the fact that a lot of people don't know what an ambassador really does.
Right.
If you were to explain to somebody who doesn't know anything about diplomacy.
It's a little different in each place. Here in South Korea, we have this great alliance. We've been building it up over the last year especially and doing so much together. Visits on each side to Seoul or to Washington, our work together from capitals on important issues of extended deterrence, our nuclear umbrella, our new nuclear consultative group, working on more what you would consider defense and foreign policy issues and more traditional diplomacy. When I was in a place as ambassador in Colombia or Kosovo, it's much more operational. So it's a different pace and a different objective or a different kind of work environment. If you're asking, you know, what do you do on a typical day? Well, one of the things I'm doing today is having an interview with you. I had breakfast with some other ambassadors this morning and work the rest of the day on various issues. Sometimes it's with Korean government, sometimes it's with civil society, sometimes is an interview with the press. And what we do as diplomats are based on our values and our interests. Some combination of both. But in our case, values very much are focused in our foreign policy on rule of law, on democracy, on freedom. And that's really the basis for which, the principles for which we stand. And you know, sometimes our interests are mixed into it, and sometimes you have to weigh those things. For the United States, that's very much the case, where values infuse our foreign policy and what we do as diplomats.
I was in Boston this summer.
How long did you spend there?
Just a few days, just for the 4th of July celebration, because I heard if you want to see the real 4th of July celebration in the US, I have to go to the Harbor Fest.
The Harbor Fest might be something new, but 4th of July celebration on the Esplanade is very famous with music by the Boston Pops and fireworks along the Charles River. So yeah, that's very much a part of the Boston history.
And what for me was interesting was that the historical reenactment of reading of the Declaration of Independence from the State House window.
Yeah.
I was amazed by the persistence of political discourse in the US. How much of American value today do you think can still be traced to what I've seen in Boston?
A lot. You know, Boston was really the hotbed of the revolution. Like at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world. were in the Boston area. So a lot of the revolution took place there, and of course the famous dumping of British tea in the harbor to revolt against British taxation. Some of the intellectual fervor also came during the period in Philadelphia when these documents were worked on and announced. I think those values still relate to our thinking, although some of the later documents, I think the most important one being our Constitution, that was written after independence, is what really forms the basis of what Americans think of in terms of our values. The idea that laws are above men, and the Declaration of Independence is our fundamental document where we say these are the rights that we believe pertain to humankind, but also especially this was the basis for our independence. And what's really interesting is that succeeding generations of Americans, regardless of their ethnicity, race, religion, adhere to those principles because those are the principles that made us great. And they relate to universal values, we believe, and that's why we stick to them so closely.
My channel started out originally as a channel about European history.
European history.
That was my primary personal interest.
Interesting.
And the most fascinating books that I've read on European history was a biography of Talleyrand. There was an interesting sentence in the book where he defines the role of diplomacy. He says, it's not the art of I gotcha, it's the art of not making the other person blush. What do you think about this quotation?
I like that quotation. The one I remember about Talleyrand was that the essence of diplomacy is to recognize the inevitable and to accelerate its outcome. That's something that informed me about diplomacy, not to sweat some of the details that there's nothing you can do about. But I think, you know, what he was getting at and what is important in diplomacy, essential in diplomacy. And I was mentioning how each place you go is a little bit different. The culture of the country is different. The language is different. So what you have to do is kind of focus on what the other side thinks and what they're looking for, and try to come to some sort of happy agreement. It's not all about just getting everything necessarily. Hopefully you do. I mean, that's what everyone wants of your list of things that you want to accomplish. But it's also understanding the other side and trying to filter that into your thinking. And I think that's probably what he meant by it, and that's what we do.
From what we see in the media, the world feels increasingly more dangerous. Like there are more countries with aggressive posturing, there are more countries that are falling into extreme nationalism or militarism. How do you think we'll get through this?
Well, I think we'll get through it as we've gotten through other periods. I think that sometimes because we're living in a certain period of time that we tend to think that it must be the most difficult and worst time ever. And then I think back about what my father used to tell me about World War II when he was in the Army for 5.5 years and didn't know if he was coming home, and all the people he knew who died during the war, or the unknown of what was going to happen and the destruction in Europe and the millions killed. You know, something that was far worse than what we are facing today. What it requires, we have what are existential threats, the biggest one probably being climate change, and understanding of people that this is something that needs to be addressed, but at the same time the difficulty sometimes in getting there. There are other geostrategic political problems and issues at the moment. There are ways to solve these issues, and diplomacy plays a very large role in that.
Finally, as somebody who's spent his entire life working with people who have different values, different religions, who come from different ethnic or historical backgrounds, what would you say to the young generation who's tearing each other apart on the internet?
Don't do it. That it won't get you anywhere. Reaching out to people, being friends with people. Look, we have it in the United States too. We have a lot of it on the internet and in our politics. Very divisive, very polarized. And in diplomacy, what we try to do is to narrow differences, but also to get along with people, even people you disagree with. And that's what I'd advise young people, but you know, I wish I had more influence than I do.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Your story about your career was fascinating. Your insight about how the world works or how we view the world, that was very helpful as well. Okay, so we have a tradition on our channel. We call our subscribers 궁금이, which means the curious ones.
궁금이.
So we have to do a big 궁금이 안녕히 계세요 with a big wave of hand, staring directly at the camera.
궁금이
안녕히 계세요.
계세요.
Ready?
Yeah.
오늘은 미국 대사님과 함께 점점 혼란해지는 이 세계에서 외교의 역할이 뭔지에 대한 깊은 대화를 나눠봤습니다. 오늘 조승연의 탐구생활은 여기서 마무리하고요. 다음번엔 더 재밌는 문화 역사 이야기로 찾아뵙겠습니다.
궁금이 안녕.
안녕.